Members of the Old Christians Club rugby union team from Montevideo, Uruguay, were set to play a match in Santiago, Chile, against the Old Boys Club, an English rugby team. They chartered a Uruguayan Air Force twin turboprop Fairchild FH-227D airplane to fly the team over the Andes Mountains to Santiago. The aircraft carried 40 passengers and 5 crew members. The pilot in command, Colonel Julio César Ferradas, was an experienced Air Force pilot with 5,117 hours of flight time. He was accompanied by co-pilot Lieutenant-Colonel Dante Héctor Lagurara. There were 10 extra seats, so the team invited friends and family members to accompany them. As they flew above the Andes, clouds obscured the mountains below. Due to cloud cover, the pilots were flying under instrument at an altitude of 8,000 feet at High Planchen Pass, and could not visually confirm their location from the terrain below. At 3:21 p.m., Lagurara notified air traffic controllers that he expected to reach the airport a minute later. But he did not see the aircraft's navigation radio displaying that they were still 60 kilometers or 37 miles away. He requested permission from air traffic control to descend. The controller authorized the aircraft to descend to 11,500 feet, unaware the airplane was still flying over the Andes. The aircraft encountered severe turbulence as it descended. Finally, the pilots noticed that they were heading straight into the mountain face. Shocked, they began to climb until the plane was nearly vertical and it began to stall and shake. The aircraft's ground collision alarm started sounding. The plane gained enough altitude to climb over the ridge and were able to bring the aircraft nose over the ridge, but at 3:34 p.m. the lower part of the tail hit the ridge at 13,800 feet. When the tail was sheared off, it took with it the rear part of the aircraft, including 2 rows of seats, baggage hold, vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizer, leaving a gaping hole in the rear. 3 passengers, the navigator and the flight attendant, were lost with the tail section. The aircraft's momentum carried it forward and upward until a rock outcropping at 4,400 foot tore off the left wing. Its propeller sliced through the fuselage. 2 more passengers fell out of the gaping hole in the rear. The fuselage crashed onto the snow and slided 2,379 foot down the steep slope of the glacier at 350 km per hour or 220 miles per hour, rammed into a snow bank and came to a sudden stop. The seats broke loose from the floor and were thrown against the front of the plane. The impact crushed the cockpit, pinning both pilots against the instrument panel, killing Ferradas immediately. The plane's fuselage came to rest in the glacier at an elevation of 12,057 feet, in the Mendoza province, Argentina. Of the 45 people aboard the aircraft, 3 passengers and 2 crew members in the rear section of the fuselage died when the tail cone was ripped from the fuselage: Lieutenant Ramon Sal Martinez, navigator, Ovidio Ramirez, steward, Gaston Costumel, Alexis Howney, and Guido Magri. A few seconds later, Daniel Shaw and Carlos Valletta also fell out of the rear fuselage, killing Shaw. Valletta survived the fall, but fell into deep snow and asphyxiated while stumbling down the snow-covered glacier. When the fuselage slammed into the snow bank, the remaining seats broke loose from the floor, crushing the passengers. Team physician Dr. Francisco Nicola, his wife Esther Nicola, Eugenia Paradu, and Fernando Vasquez were killed. Co-pilot Lagurara was critically injured and trapped in the crushed cockpit. He asked one of the passengers to find his pistol and shoot him, but the passengers refused. 33 passengers remained alive, although many were critically or seriously injured. Their wounds included broken legs. Both of Arturo Noguera's legs were broken in several places. Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, both medical students, quickly triaged the wounded and first treated those they could help most. Nando Paradu had a skull fracture and he remained unconscious for 3 days. Enrique Platero had a piece of metal stuck in his abdomen that, when removed, brought a few inches of intestine with it. He nonetheless immediately began helping others. The Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service was notified within the hour that the flight was missing. 4 aircraft began to search for the aircraft based on its last reported position. Unbeknownst to the search teams, the flight had crashed in Argentina even before crossing into Chile. On the second day, 11 aircraft from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay searched for the missing flight. The search area covered the accident location and a few aircraft even overflew the crash site. The survivors tried to use lipstick recovered from their luggage to write an SOS message on the roof of the fuselage, but did not have enough lipstick to make large letters that could be seen from the air by rescuers. They also used luggage to fashion a cross on the snow, but it failed to attract the attention of the rescuers. The survivors saw aircraft overfly the crash site on 3 occasions, but the rescuers were unable to spot the white fuselage against the snow. The harsh conditions gave the rescuers little hope that they would find anyone alive, so rescue efforts were cancelled after 8 days of searching. On October 21, after having searched for more than 142 hours, the searchers terminated the search. They planned to resume the search to recover the victims in December after the snow melted. Another 5 passengers and crew died during the first night: co-pilot Lagurara, Francisco Abel, Graciela Mariani, Felipe Maquiriane, and Julio Martinez Lamas. The remaining 28 survivors removed the broken seats and other debris to fashion the fuselage into a shelter 8 feet by 10 feet. After 3 days, Paradu regained consciousness only to learn that his mother had died and his 19-year-old sister Susanna was severely injured. He tried to keep his sister alive, but on the 9th day, she too died from her injuries. The remaining 27 survivors had a hard time during the nights, when temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius or -22 degrees Fahrenheit. They found a small AM transistor radio jammed between 2 aircraft seats. Roy Harley improvised a long antenna using electrical wire from the plane, and on the 11th day on the mountain heard the news that their search had been called off. The survivors had very little food to eat. They found 8 chocolate bars, 3 small jars of jam, a tin of mussels, a tin of almonds, a few dates, some candy, dried plums, and several bottles of wine. They rationed the meager supply of food, but it lasted only a week. Paradu ate a single chocolate-covered peanut over 3 days. Far above the timber line, there was no vegetation or animals. When the food ran out, they ate the cotton stuffing from the seats and leather from belts and shoes, which made them sick. Knowing that rescue efforts had been called off and facing certain death from starvation, the survivors gave each other permission to use their bodies for food in case they died. Left with no alternative, the survivors consumed the bodies of their deceased friends and relatives. The group survived by eating the bodies of the dead. This decision was not taken lightly, as most of the dead were classmates, close friends, or relatives. Canessa cut the meat with a shard of broken windshield glass. He set the example by swallowing the first matchstick-sized lump of human flesh. Several others followed over the next few days, but a few still kept refusing to eat it. They dried the meat from the bodies in the sun to make it easier to eat. At first, they were so disgusted by the experience that they could only eat skin, muscle, and fat, but in the end they also ate hearts, lungs, and even brains. Some, including Kosh Insiart and Numa Turcati, only ate the bare minimum necessary for survival, due to their deep revulsion. Javier Methal and his wife Liliana, the only surviving female passenger at the time, were the last to eat human flesh. Close to midnight on October 29, an avalanche struck the fuselage while the survivors were asleep, almost completely filling the fuselage with snow and ice and smothering 8 people to death: Enrique Platero, Liliana Methal, Gustavo Nicolich, Daniel Mospons, Juan Menendez, Diego Storm, Carlos Roque, and Marcelo Perez. The survivors trapped inside quickly realized they would soon run out of air. They managed to pry open one of the cockpit windscreens and to poke a hole through the snow for air. On the morning of October 31, they were able to dig an exit tunnel to the surface, only to be faced with a blizzard that made them crawl back into the fuselage. The blizzard raged furiously for 3 days, trapping the survivors together with the bodies of the deceased inside the snow-filled fuselage. The decision was made for a few survivors to leave on an expedition to get help. Canessa, Paradu, and Vizintin were among the most physically fit and volunteered to go for help. On November 15, after several hours of walking 1.6 kilometers or 1 mile downhill east of the fuselage, they found the tail section of the aircraft. They also found luggage with a box of chocolates, 3 meat patties, a bottle of rum, bottles of Coca-Cola, cigarettes, extra clothes, comic books, some medicine, and, most importantly, the aircraft's batteries. They decided to bring the batteries to the fuselage and hoped they could power the radio and make an SOS call to Santiago for help. The trio found that the batteries were far too heavy to carry back to the fuselage. Instead, they decided it would be better to return to the fuselage, disconnect the radio, and bring it back to the tail section where the batteries were. But, the radio required 115-volt AC power while the battery from the tail section only supplied 24-volt DC, thus dooming their plan. Arturo Noguera died on November 15 and 3 days later, Rafael Echeverren also died, both from their infected wounds. Numa Turcati, who's barely at human flesh, died on day 60, December 11, weighing only 25 kilograms or 55 pounds. The survivors heard on the transistor radio that the Uruguayan Air Force had resumed searching for them. The remaining survivors came to the realization that the only way out was to climb over the mountains on the western rim. While the remaining survivors encouraged Paradu to go on the expedition, no one actually volunteered to go with him. Paradu finally persuaded Canessa it was time to set out, and together with Vizintin, the three men began climbing the mountain on December 12. Based on the aircraft's broken altimeter, they thought they were at 2,100 meters, 7,000 feet, when they were actually at 3,664 meters, 12,020 feet. They also believed, based on the co-pilot's dying words, that they had overflown Curacao, near the western edge of the Andes. They thought the closest help lay due west. As a result, they only brought along a 3-day supply of meat for the three of them. They had no rock climbing gear, no area map, no compass, and no climbing experience. On December 12, 1972, Paradu, Canessa, and Vizintin began climbing out of the glacier. The thin oxygen-poor air made climbing difficult. During certain sections of the climb, they sank up to their hips in the summer-softened snow. The climb was slow and tedious. The survivors at the base camp watched them climb for 3 long days. On the third morning after starting out, Canessa stayed back at the campsite. Vizintin and Paradu reached the base of a nearly vertical 100-meter, 330 feet, tall wall. The wall was covered with snow and ice. Paradu used a stick he brought along to carve steps in the ice wall. He reached the 4,503 meters, 14,774 feet, ridge. Believing he would see the green valleys of Chile to the west, he was stunned when he was faced with seemingly unending snow-capped mountain peaks extending in every direction. They decided that Vizintin should return to base camp so the other two might have enough food to complete their journey. Vizintin's return was entirely downhill, and he used an aircraft seat as a makeshift sleigh to make it back down to base camp within the hour. Paradu saw 2 lower peaks near the western horizon that were clear of snow, with the valley at the foot of their mountain slowly winding its way towards those peaks. Paradu was sure the valley was the way out of the mountains and refused to give up hope. They followed the ridge towards the valley for a considerable distance as they descended. Paradu and Canessa hiked down for 7 more days into Chile. They reached the narrow valley that Paradu had seen from the top of the mountain, where they find a river. They followed along the river and reached the snowline. Gradually they started seeing ever more signs of human life, first, an empty soup can, and finally, on the 9th day, some cows. Canessa was exhausted and unable to keep walking, so they rested for the evening. As they gathered wood for a fire, they saw 3 men on horseback on the other side of the river. Paradu called out to them, but the noise of the river made it impossible to communicate. One of the men across the river saw Paradu and Canessa and shouted back, "Tomorrow." The next day, the man returned, scribbled a note, tied the note with a pencil to a stone and threw the stone across the river to Paradu. Paradu written that they were the survivors from the flight crash and threw the note back. The man read the note and could not imagine that anyone would still be alive. He threw a loaf of bread to the 2 men across the river and rode west for 10 hours to get help. During the trip, he ran into another man and asked him to ride towards the survivors and take them to the Los Maitens village. So the second man brought Paradu and Canessa to Los Maitens, where they were fed and allowed to rest. When the news broke out that survivors had emerged from the crash of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, the story of their 72-day ordeal drew international attention. The Chilean Air Force sent helicopters to the rescue. They flew in heavy cloud cover under instrument to Los Maitines, where the Army interviewed Paradu and Canessa. Once the fog lifted at noon, Paradu guided the helicopters to the crash site in Argentina with the pilot's map he had brought with him. The pilots were astounded at the difficult terrain the two men had crossed to get help. The two helicopters arrived at the crash site on the afternoon of December 22, 1972. Due to the altitude and weight limits, the two helicopters were able to take only half of the survivors. 4 of the rescuers volunteered to stay behind with the remaining 8 survivors for their last night on the mountain. The second flight of helicopters arrived the following morning at daybreak. The last remaining survivors were rescued on December 23, 1972, more than 2.5 months after the crash. Out of the 45 passengers, only 16 had survived the crash. The Argentine authorities and the victims' families buried the remains of the victims at the crash site in a common grave. So that's all we got about the Andes flight disaster, and thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit the subscribe button, and if you have something to say, please leave a comment.